this video, I'm going to talk about the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex, and that's the layer of gray matter on the outside of the cerebrum. So here we're looking at a brain from the left side, and there's been some colors drawn in here, but this is all gray matter cortex on the outside of the cerebrum. And down here's the cerebellum, and here's the brainstem. And the cerebral cortex has these ridges and these grooves on its surface. It's kind of all wrinkled up and folded up. And these ridges, like let me just pick this one right here, these ridges are called gyri. Gyri, that's the plural. A single one is called a gyrus, multiple is called gyri. And then these small grooves that are on either side of a gyrus like this are called sulci. Sulci, that's multiple, and it'd be sulcus for just one, so this would be one sulcus right here. And so that's a small groove, but there's also some really large grooves like this one right here. And those large grooves we usually call fissures. Fissures. Like this one right here that goes back like that. Now we divide the cerebral cortex into lobes, and we name them the same as the bones of the skull that are right over those areas of cerebral cortex. So that this big lobe right in the front here under the frontal bone is called the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, that's this one right here. This one behind the frontal lobe is right next to the parietal bone of the skull, so we call that the parietal lobe. This one right here on the other side of this big fissure from the frontal lobe is by the temporal bone, so we call that the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. And this one way in the back is by the occipital bone of the skull. Occipital, so we call it the occipital lobe of the brain. There are some other areas of cerebral cortex that we can't see with this illustration. Like if we pull apart this fissure right here, there's some in there. And on the other side, on the side in between the two cerebral hemispheres, there are some other areas. But when people talk about cerebral lobes, they're usually referring to one of these four, the frontal, parietal, temporal, or occipital lobes of the brain. And there's a lot going on in the cerebral cortex. It's really the most complex part of the entire nervous system, and the most complex types of information processing and functions of the nervous system occur in the cerebral cortex. So I'm just briefly going to touch on a couple of the functions of the cerebral cortex because there's so much going on, but I'll save lots of the other details for later videos. I want to mention a couple things about some of the senses and motor functions of the cerebral cortex, and that's that a couple of the senses and the motor functions of the cerebral cortex on one side of the brain tend to be involved with the other side of the body and the environment. For example, visual information coming in onto one side of the body, so let's say visual information over here on the right side of this person coming in this way, is going to end up being processed in part of the cerebral cortex on the other side of the brain. Let me just draw a little bit of color over here to represent that visual information from the right side of this person is going to end up in the left side of the brain, and vice versa. And actually it ends up tending to be back here in the occipital lobe where most of the visual processing, the areas of the cerebral cortex doing visual stuff, handles that information. The same is true for somatosensory information. Somatosensory information coming in to one side of the body, because of the way this information travels in the nervous system, is primarily going to get processed in areas of cerebral cortex on the other side of the brain. So for example, if something hot or cold, some kind of temperature stimulus is applied to the skin over here on the right side of this person, that information will actually end up over here on the left side of the brain in the cerebral cortex, somewhere around here, to get processed and brought to consciousness so that it can be perceived. Almost all of the other senses, besides vision and somatosensation, tend to get processed in areas of cerebral cortex on both sides. So if stimuli involving these other senses are coming in to this person from the right side, usually there's going to be areas of cerebral cortex on both sides of the brain that are going to do some processing of that information. But for visual information and somatosensory information, that predominantly makes it over to the other side of the brain. Similarly, motor information about movement and control of skeletal muscles, which involves areas of cerebral cortex around here, this area of cerebral cortex will be controlling muscles in general on the other side of the body. So if I kind of draw some red in over here on the left side of this person's cerebrum, that information will get carried by upper motor neurons down to lower motor neurons on the other side of the spinal cord, and that's going to affect movement of the other side of the body. So for instance, I'll just shade in this leg red here, that the muscles of the right leg would primarily be controlled by areas of cerebral cortex on the left side of this person's cerebrum. Now, if we take a big step back and look at the cerebral cortex as a whole, we can divide up the cerebral cortex into a couple of types based on what kind of function that area of cerebral cortex is performing. The first type we call primary. So a primary cortex is one that's performing basic motor or sensory functions. And that's in contrast to other areas of cerebral cortex that we call association cortex. Association. And the idea with this word is that they're associating different types of information to do more complex processing and functions. So for example, for the areas of motor cortex, there's a primary motor cortex that's kind of doing the basic motor functions. And then there are association motor cortices. They're doing more complex motor functions like planning of movements. And then there are areas of association cortex that are taking in different types of information, like maybe somatosensory information and visual information. And they're integrating that information and doing higher level processing to perform complex motor or sensory functions and to produce the higher functions of the nervous system, like cognition, emotion, and consciousness. One aspect of cognition is language, which could be described as the ability to turn thoughts into words, and vice versa. And in most people, that's performed by certain areas of cerebral cortex in the left hemisphere. There are some people that have language functions in the cerebral cortex on both sides, or even all on the right side, but most people have language functions occurring in cerebral cortex just in the left cerebral hemisphere, or predominantly in the left cerebral hemisphere. One last thing I want to mention is attention, which is another important function of the cerebral cortex. And there are lots of areas of cerebral cortex on both sides that play a big role in attention. But in particular, in most people, the right cerebral hemisphere, areas of cortex over there in the right cerebral hemisphere, play a role in paying attention to both sides of the body and the environment. Whereas in a lot of people, the left hemisphere seems to predominantly just pay attention to the right side of the body and the environment. So there are some additional attention functions being carried out by the right hemisphere that are not carried out in most people in the left hemisphere. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of the structure and the function of the cerebral cortex and how these areas of cerebral cortex connect to and work with other areas of the nervous system. For example, these motor cortices work with the basal ganglia, some of those deep subcortical cerebral structures, and the cerebellum to perform a lot of different motor functions. And for almost all these parts of the cerebral cortex and the functions they perform, there are lots of connections between areas of cerebral cortex and between areas of cerebral cortex and other parts of the nervous system that are important. But I'll stop there just to give a little bit of an overview of the structure and some of the functions of the cerebral cortex. So I'm going to talk about the cerebellum. Cerebellum, which sounds a lot like the cerebrum, but it's a different part of the brain. So if we look at the brain over here from the front, we have the cerebrum on top with the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And we have the brainstem underneath that connecting to the spinal cord. And then behind the brainstem and below the cerebrum is the cerebellum. Let me just color that in here. And you can't see it that well from the front because it's behind the brainstem. But if we come over here to the back, if we're looking at the back of the brain, the cerebrum is on top. Here would be the left cerebral hemisphere, and here would be the right cerebral hemisphere. And here you can see more of the cerebellum because it's behind the brainstem. So now we can't see much of the brainstem because the cerebellum is covering it up. And the cerebellum is also divided into hemispheres. Here would be the left cerebellar hemisphere, and here's the right cerebellar hemisphere. And then we can just see the brainstem and coming into the spinal cord down here, but we've cut off the spinal cord. Now the cerebellum does a number of different functions, but probably the most obvious thing that it does is it coordinates movement. Coordinates movement. And it's pretty neat how it does this, how it works with the other motor structures in the nervous system to coordinate movements, because the cerebellum really smooths out movements and it makes them more accurate. Like if you're trying to touch something with your finger, the cerebellum plays a big role in your accuracy in your finger touching the object that you're shooting for. And there's kind of three parts to how information travels into and out of the cerebellum to let it do its job of coordinating movements. So let me write three little marks here. We'll quickly go over the three parts. And the first thing the cerebellum needs to do is it needs to get information about the motor plan. Motor plan. And the motor plan involves which muscles need to contract and at what intensity and what duration. How strongly to contract those muscles and for how long to contract those muscles to do some kind of movement that you want to do. And don't worry about the anatomy of this stuff for this introductory discussion of the cerebellum, but in other videos we can go into more detail on how the motor plan is developed up in areas of the cerebral hemisphere that plan movements. And then to make those movements happen, upper motor neurons up here in the cerebrum send their axons down through the cerebrum and the brainstem, and they cross over, and don't worry about the anatomy of this, but then they talk to lower motor neurons. For example, some lower motor neurons in the upper part of the spinal cord here that'll send information out, let's say to a muscles in the arm that'll tell the arm to move in a certain direction and do some kind of movement with the arm that you want to do. And that actually makes the movement happen. But while all that is going on, while the movement is actually being executed by the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons and the muscles that they're synapsing on, information about that motor plan is also being sent to the cerebellum. So there's another pathway that sends information down through the cerebrum and into the brainstem, and then that information passes over and into the cerebellum so that the cerebellum is aware of the motor plan. So now that the cerebellum is aware of what the motor plan is, now it wants to know how the movement is actually going so that it receives position sense information. Position sense information. And this is position sense information that isn't reaching consciousness. We're not aware of it. It's just going to the cerebellum so that there are receptors involved in position sense, like the muscle spindles that sense stretch of skeletal muscles out here in the body. And then somatosensory neurons bring that information back into, say, the spinal cord, if we're talking about a movement of the arm. And then once that information enters the spinal cord, there are tracks that'll carry that information up into the brainstem and then into the cerebellum. So that now the cerebellum knows what the motor plan was, and it can compare that to the movement that's actually occurring by looking at this position sense information. And it can see if the movement's occurring according to plan, or if corrections are necessary, if the movement needs to be fixed somehow to make it smoother and more accurate. And usually that is the case. There does need to be some kind of correction to get the movement to match the motor plan. So then the cerebellum needs to send feedback back to the motor areas, back to the motor areas of the cerebrum, the areas that came up with the motor plan in the first place, to try to correct that movement while it's occurring. So that feedback information will travel from the cerebellum through the brainstem and into parts of the cerebrum, and then back to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. And then they can use that feedback information from the cerebellum to fix the movement to make it smoother and more accurate by changing the activity of the upper motor neurons. That'll change the activity of the lower motor neurons. That'll change the activity of the skeletal muscles that are performing the movement. So again, don't worry about the actual anatomy and the pathways now at this introductory level, but this is kind of the bird's eye view of the way information flows in and out of the cerebellum to help coordinate movements. And without getting too deep into the anatomy of the cerebellum, one little detail about the way the cerebellum is set up in general is that the kind of middle part of the cerebellum here, toward the midline, tends to mostly coordinate kind of movements involving the middle of the body, I like to think of, and in particular walking. So the muscles of the trunk and the legs involved in walking get a lot of coordination from the middle of the cerebellum here, while the part of the cerebellum more on the side here, farther over to the side of the cerebellar hemisphere, is more involved in coordinating movements of the limbs. So coordinating movements of the arms and the legs when they're being used kind of individually. That involves a lot of activity of the cerebellum over on the side here. And then a bunch of different parts of the cerebellum coordinate movements involved in speech. Let me just draw a little mouth here saying hi, because we actually have lots of little muscles that have to move in our lips and tongue and throat to speak properly and to enunciate. And if the cerebellum isn't functioning properly, we can have trouble coordinating those and trouble enunciating. and the cerebellum, parts of the cerebellum, are also very involved in moving our eyes around. These are not very good drawings of eyes, but the movements of the eyes to look where we want to look depend on functions of the cerebellum that kind of coordinate those muscles that move the eyes. So there's a lot more details to the cerebellum, but I'll stop here because I just kind of want to introduce where the cerebellum is and kind of its major function in coordinating movements and the different types of information it uses to accomplish that function.
The brainstem is a stalk that leaves the base of the brain and connects the brain to the spinal cord. It contains many important pathways that run between the brain and spinal cord, as well as pathways to other areas like the cerebellum. It also contains a large number of important nuclei and is essential for both survival and proper cognitive functioning. It consists of three major divisions: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla oblongata, often simply called the medulla, is the point where the brainstem connects to the spinal cord. The medulla is essential for survival, as it contains nuclei that ensure vital systems like the cardiovascular and respiratory systems are working properly. The medulla also contains nuclei that are responsible for a number of reflexive actions, including vomiting, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Several cranial nerves also exit the brainstem at the level of the medulla. The next structure on our way up the brainstem is the pons. The word pons means bridge in Latin, and the pons is a large, rounded structure resembling a rounded bridge that connects the medulla and the midbrain. The pons is home to a number of nuclei for cranial nerves and contains nuclei that deal with sensations from the head and face, motor movement of the eyes, face, and mouth, hearing, equilibrium, and autonomic functions like tear and saliva production. The final branch of the brainstem as we move toward the cerebrum is called the midbrain. On the posterior side of the midbrain, we find four bumps representing two paired structures, the superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are involved in eye movements and visual processing, while the inferior colliculi are involved in auditory processing. The midbrain also contains the major dopamine-producing nuclei of the brain, the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra. Among other functions, the ventral tegmental area is involved in motivation and reward, while the substantia nigra plays an important role in movement.